The burgundy dress hung in my closet like a ghost of better times. I'd worn it to Sarah's high school graduation, then to her college commencement, and later to celebrate her first promotion at the marketing firm. Each time she'd complimented how elegant I looked, how proud she was to have me as her mother. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my 62-year-old frame, I wondered if this would be the last time I'd dress up for my daughter. 3 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about her wedding budget. $65,000. That's what Sarah and her fiancé David had demanded I contribute. Not asked, demanded. As if my late husband's life insurance money, the nest egg I'd carefully preserved for my retirement, was somehow their birthright. "Mom, you're being selfish," she'd said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "You're sitting on all that money while we're trying to start our life together. Don't you want me to be happy?" I tried to explain that happiness didn't require imported Italian marble for a bathroom renovation or a destination honeymoon in the Maldives. I'd offered $15,000, a generous sum that would cover a beautiful local ceremony. But Sarah had looked at me with such contempt, such calculation, that I barely recognized the little girl who used to bring me dandelions and call them sunshine flowers. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending my small garden behind the duplex I downsized to after Robert's death. Sarah's voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we've both been too stubborn. Could we talk over dinner? I want to work this out." My heart had lifted despite myself. Perhaps the silence between us had given her time to reflect. Perhaps becoming a mother herself, she was 3 months along, barely showing, had awakened something in her that understood sacrifice, understood the weight of protecting what you'd built. "I'd like that, sweetheart," I'd said, already planning what I'd cook, what I'd say to rebuild the bridge between us. "Actually, David and I thought we'd take you out somewhere nice. You know, that Italian place on Meridian Street, Francesca's." Francesca's, where Robert had taken me for our 25th anniversary, where the tables were intimate and the lighting soft enough to hide the tears I suspected we'd both shed as we found our way back to each other. Now, as I applied my lipstick with the steady hand of a woman who'd learned to present strength even when she felt brittle, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe Sarah's pregnancy had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized that family meant more than extravagant weddings and social media-worthy celebrations. The drive to Francesca's took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised Sarah and her older brother Daniel. Past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in the library, past the park where I'd pushed her on swings until my arms ached. Past the community center where I taught her to waltz before her first formal dance. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to close. Francesca's looked exactly as I remembered. Warm brick facade, window boxes overflowing with late autumn mums, the soft glow of candlelight visible through gauze curtains. I checked my watch. 6:30 exactly. Sarah had always appreciated punctuality, a trait she'd inherited from her father. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, led me to a corner table where Sarah was already seated. My daughter looked radiant in the way only pregnant women can. Her skin glowing, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a designer dress I didn't recognize, something that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Mom." She rose to embrace me, and for a moment, breathing in her familiar perfume, I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my life for 34 years. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." I meant it. Whatever our differences, whatever pain lay between us, she was still my daughter. "How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" "Better now. The second trimester is supposed to be easier." She touched her belly with a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "David should be here any minute. He got held up at the office." David Miller, 36 years old, ambitious, charming when he wanted to be. He worked for a commercial real estate firm and had the kind of confidence that came from a life without significant setbacks. I tried to like him, tried to see what Sarah saw beyond his expensive suits and casual dismissal of anyone he deemed less successful than himself. "I'm glad you called," I said, settling into my chair. "I've missed you." Something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Regret? But before I could examine it further, David appeared at our table, not alone, but followed by 3 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. "Mrs. Richardson," David said, his smile too bright, too practiced. "Thank you for joining us." The men took seats around our small table, transforming our intimate dinner into what felt like a business meeting. My stomach tightened as I recognized the choreographed nature of their arrival. This wasn't coincidence. This was planned. "Sarah," I said carefully, "who are these gentlemen?" "Mom, these are some colleagues of David's." Her voice was steady, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at." One of the men, silver-haired with the kind of predatory smile I'd learned to recognize in my years as a secretary at the law firm, leaned forward. "Mrs. Richardson, I'm Richard Collins, David's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will be beneficial for everyone involved." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that I'd experienced 3 weeks ago when Sarah had first made her demands. But this time, instead of anger, I felt something colder, something that had been building in the weeks of silence. "What kind of documents?" I asked, though I already knew this conversation would end badly. David cleared his throat. "It's really quite simple, Mrs. Richardson. We're asking you to sign a power of attorney that would allow us to manage your financial affairs. Given your age and the fact that you're living alone now, it just makes sense to have someone younger handling your investments, your property decisions." "My age," I repeated quietly. "I'm 62, David. Not 92. "Of course," he said, his tone patronizing. "But you have to admit, these things are complex. Real estate markets, investment portfolios. It's not something you should have to worry about." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to show some sign that this ambush wasn't her idea. But she sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table. The attorney pushed a manila folder across the table. "If you could just sign here and initial there, we can get everything squared away tonight." I opened the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. Power of attorney documents that would give David and Sarah control over my bank accounts, my house, my insurance policies, everything Robert and I had worked 40 years to build. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Sarah finally looked up, and the expression in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, final. "Then you won't see your grandson grow up," she said simply. "It's your choice, Mom. But I think you should know that David and I have been talking to a lawyer about grandparents' rights. Apparently, they're quite limited, especially when the grandparent has shown a pattern of being difficult." The restaurant seemed to fade around me. The soft jazz music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other diners, it all became white noise. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, celebrated through every milestone, and tried to understand when exactly she'd become a stranger. "I see," I said quietly. I reached into my purse, past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo of Sarah and Daniel that I'd carried for years. My fingers found my phone, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. "Mom," Sarah's voice had a note of uncertainty now. "What are you doing?" I pressed the call button and waited for the familiar voice to answer. "Hello, Daniel. It's Mom. I need you to come to Francesca's restaurant on Meridian Street now." "Yes, I know it's late. I know you have work in the morning. Just come." I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table beside the manila folder. I said, looking directly at Sarah, that before I sign anything, someone wants to say a few words. The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. David shifted in his seat, his confident facade cracking slightly around the edges. The three lawyers exchanged glances, the kind of look seasoned predators share when their prey doesn't behave as expected. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager. "There's no need to involve Daniel in this. This is between us, is it?" I folded my hands in my lap, surprised by how steady they felt. "Because it seems to me that when you bring three lawyers to what you called a reconciliation dinner, you've already involved quite a few people." Richard Collins cleared his throat. "Mrs. Richardson, perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional." "Can they?" I met his gaze directly. "How thoughtful of you to notice." 23 minutes. That's how long it would take Daniel to drive from his apartment downtown if he hit the lights right. 23 minutes during which I had to navigate this minefield without stepping on the explosives my daughter had so carefully arranged. David leaned forward, his salesman's smile firmly in place. "Look, Mrs. Richardson, Margaret. May I call you Margaret? We're going to be family soon. You may call me Mrs. Richardson." His smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course, Mrs. Richardson. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you manage your assets more efficiently. You know, maximize your returns, make sure you're positioned well for retirement." "I see. And how much would this help cost me?" "I'm sorry. Your help managing my assets. What's your fee?" The lawyers stirred like vultures, sensing weakness, but I wasn't the one who was weak. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There would be some administrative costs naturally, but really this is about family, about making sure Sarah and the baby are secure." "The baby?" I turned to my daughter, who was studying her manicured nails with sudden intensity. "Tell me, Sarah, when exactly did you start planning this evening?" "Mom, I don't know what you mean. When did you call David's lawyer friends? Before or after you called me about reconciliation?" She lifted her chin, and there was Robert's stubborn streak, twisted into something I didn't recognize. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." "Fine." The word came out sharp, brittle. "We've been discussing options for weeks. Ever since you made it clear that you don't care about my happiness or my future." "Options." I tasted the word, found it bitter. "Is that what we're calling extortion now?" "It's not extortion." Sarah's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. "It's family. It's what families do for each other." "What families do," I said quietly, "is support each other without lawyers and ultimatums." One of the unnamed attorneys, younger than Collins, with nervous energy that suggested he was new to this kind of work, leaned forward. "Mrs. Richardson, if I may, you should know that grandparents' rights in this state are quite limited. If your daughter chooses to restrict access to her child, your legal recourse would be—" "Excuse me." The voice came from behind me, familiar and warm. Daniel stood beside our table, still wearing his hospital scrubs, his dark hair mussed from what had obviously been a rush drive. At 37, my son had inherited his father's steady presence and his grandmother's sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Dr. Thompson," he said to the table in general, though his gaze lingered on David. "I believe you called me, Mom." I did. I gestured to an empty chair the hostess had quickly provided. "Daniel, I'd like you to meet your sister's colleagues." Daniel's eyes swept the table, taking in the lawyers, the manila folder, the tension thick enough to cut. As an emergency room physician, he'd learned to assess situations quickly, and I watched him catalog every detail with the precision that had made him one of the youngest department heads at Methodist Hospital. "Colleagues," he repeated. "I see. And they are?" David stood, extending his hand. David Miller, your sister's fiancé. These are some business associates of mine. We were just discussing some financial planning with your mother. Daniel shook David's hand briefly, then sat down without acknowledging the lawyers. Financial planning at Francesca's on a Tuesday night with Sarah 3 months pregnant. He looked at his sister. How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications? I'm fine, Sarah said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. Good. That's good. Daniel picked up the manila folder, flipped through it with the casual expertise of someone who'd seen plenty of legal documents. Power of attorney. Interesting. Mom, did you ask for help managing your finances? I did not. He closed the folder, set it aside. David, Sarah, gentlemen, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother? Now, wait just a minute, David started, but Daniel's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. I'm not asking. Something in my son's tone, the same authority he used when dealing with difficult patients or uncooperative family members in the ER, made the lawyers shift uncomfortably. David looked to Sarah for support, but she was staring at her hands again. We'll be right over there, Richard Collins said, gesturing toward the bar area. Mrs. Richardson, please don't make any hasty decisions. After they'd moved away, Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mom, talk to me. What's really going on here? For the first time that evening, I felt tears threaten. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of recognition, of knowing that at least one of my children still saw me as a person rather than a resource to be managed. They want me to sign over power of attorney, I said. Sarah says if I don't, I won't see my grandchild. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I remembered from his childhood. Something he did when he was thinking hard, working through a complex problem. How much did they ask you for originally for the wedding? $65,000. He whistled low. And you offered 15, which is generous. More than generous. He glanced toward the bar where David was gesticulating to the lawyers, probably explaining why this family meeting wasn't going according to plan. Mom, I need to ask you something and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Are you having any problems? Memory issues, confusion, anything that might make them think you need help managing your affairs? I almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was funny. Daniel, last month I balanced my checkbook to the penny, renegotiated my car insurance to save $200 a year, and caught an error in my property tax assessment that saved me $800. Does that sound like someone who needs financial management? No, it doesn't. His jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of Robert when he was truly angry. Not the quick flash of irritation, but the deep, cold fury that came from witnessing genuine injustice. It sounds like someone who taught her son how to manage money so well that he graduated medical school with minimal debt. You worked for that. I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. You showed me how to sacrifice for what matters. He looked toward Sarah, who was watching us from across the restaurant with an expression I couldn't read. What happened to her, Mom? When did she become this person? It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, maybe years. When had my daughter's ambition curdled into entitlement? When had her dreams become demands? When had her love become conditional on what I could provide rather than who I was? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy. Or maybe David happened to her. I followed his gaze to where my daughter's fiancé was now on his phone, his voice animated, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. Even from across the room, I could see the calculation in his posture, the way he positioned himself to command attention. You think he's behind this? I think he's a man who sees an opportunity. Daniel reached across the table, covered my hand with his. But I also think Sarah is 34 years old and responsible for her own choices. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Before I could answer, David was striding back toward our table, the lawyers trailing behind him like a well-dressed pack. Sarah followed more slowly, one hand pressed to her stomach in a gesture that was either protective or performative. I could no longer tell the difference. "I'm sorry to interrupt," David said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we do have a timeline we're working with. The wedding is in 3 months, and there are vendors who need deposits, venues that need to be secured." "Of course," I said, standing up slowly. "Timeline. How thoughtful of you to mention that." I picked up my purse, checking to make sure my phone was easily accessible. Around us, the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of couples sharing wine, families celebrating birthdays, friends catching up over pasta, normal people living normal lives, unaware that at table 12, a family was being dissected with surgical precision. "I've made my decision," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah's face went very still. And I smiled. The same smile I'd worn to PTA meetings when dealing with teachers who underestimated other people's children. The same smile I'd perfected during 40 years of marriage to a man who occasionally tested my patience, but never my loyalty. "I'll sign," I said. The relief that washed over David's face was almost comical. Richard Collins actually smiled. Even Sarah seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping slightly. "But first," I continued, reaching for my phone, "there's someone else who wants to say a few words." I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd added just 2 weeks ago, a precaution I'd taken after Sarah's first ultimatum, when a mother's intuition had whispered that this reconciliation dinner might be anything but reconciling. "Helen," I said when the familiar voice answered, "It's Margaret Richardson." "Yes, I know it's late. Could you come to Francesca's restaurant on Meridian Street? Bring the documents we discussed." David's expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching alarm. "Who is Helen?" I set the phone down carefully, noting how the simple act of making a call could change the entire energy of a room. The lawyers were whispering among themselves now, and Sarah was looking between David and me with growing unease. "Helen Williams," I said pleasantly. "My attorney." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more dangerous. Richard Collins's predatory smile had vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp focus of a hunter who'd suddenly realized he might be the one being hunted. "Your attorney," David repeated slowly. "When did you hire an attorney?" "The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state," I replied, watching his face carefully. "Did you really think Mrs. Patterson wouldn't mention that a nice young man had stopped by asking whether I'd been acting strangely lately? Whether I'd been forgetting things, making poor decisions?" Sarah's face went pale. "Mom, we never." "You never what, sweetheart?" "Never had David drive through my neighborhood taking pictures of my house. Never had him chat with my mailman about whether I'd been paying my bills on time." I kept my voice conversational, almost maternal. "Never had his friend from the real estate office pull comps on my property to see what it might sell for." Daniel leaned back in his chair, and I could see him putting the pieces together with the rapid assessment skills that made him good at his job. "Jesus, Sarah, how long have you been planning this?" "It's not what you think," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I opened my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope. "Because I think it's exactly what it looks like. A systematic attempt to establish grounds for claiming I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs." I spread the contents of the envelope across the table. Photographs David had taken of my house, printed emails between him and a private investigator, copies of inquiries he'd made about my medical records, my banking habits, my daily routines. "Helen has been very thorough," I explained as the lawyers examined the documents with growing discomfort. "It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator, isn't it? Especially when that investigator looks like someone's sweet grandmother." The youngest lawyer, the nervous one, was actually sweating now. Mrs. Richardson, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions. Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack. The question is whether you gentlemen understood what you were being asked to participate in. Helen arrived exactly 12 minutes later, striding through Francesca's with the purposeful energy of a woman who'd spent 30 years practicing family law and had seen every variation of human greed and manipulation. At 70, she was small and silver-haired with the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel underestimate her at their own peril. "Margaret," she said warmly, settling into the chair Daniel had procured. "And this must be your daughter." The contrast was immediate and devastating. Where I had been isolated at this table, surrounded by predators, Helen's presence shifted the balance entirely. Suddenly, David and his lawyers were outnumbered by people who actually understood the law. "Gentlemen," Helen said, surveying the group with the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a particularly interesting tumor. "I believe you have some documents you'd like Mrs. Richardson to sign." Richard Collins cleared his throat. "This is really a family matter, Ms. Williams. Helen Williams of Williams, Peterson and Associates. And you're quite right. This is a family matter, which is why I'm here to ensure that Mrs. Richardson's family relationships aren't being exploited for financial gain." She opened her own briefcase, removing a thick folder. "Now, before we discuss any power of attorney arrangements, I think you should see what Mrs. Richardson has already put in place." The papers she spread across the table were pristine, official, bearing the seal of the county courthouse. As David leaned forward to read them, I watched his face change from confusion to understanding to something approaching panic. "Irrevocable trust," Helen explained conversationally. "Established 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Richardson's assets, her house, her investment accounts, her life insurance policies, have all been transferred to the Margaret Richardson Family Trust." "That's," David started, then stopped, his legal knowledge apparently insufficient for the situation he found himself in. "That's what, dear?" Helen asked sweetly. "The trust," Sarah said slowly, reading over David's shoulder. "It says the beneficiaries are your children. Both born and unborn," I finished, "with Daniel as the trustee until they reach the age of 25. The implications hit David like a physical blow. I could see him calculating, recalculating, trying to find an angle that would still give him access to the money he'd been counting on. "But what about the wedding?" he demanded. "What about our expenses? What about them?" Helen asked. "The trust provides for educational expenses, medical care, and reasonable living costs for the beneficiaries. I don't see how an Italian marble bathroom renovation qualifies as any of those things." "This is ridiculous," David said, his composure finally cracking. "Sarah, tell them. Tell them we had an agreement." "Did you?" Daniel asked his sister quietly. "Did you have an agreement, or did you have demands backed by threats?" Sarah looked around the table, at David's angry face, at the lawyers who were already calculating how to distance themselves from this mess, at Daniel's disappointed expression, at Helen's professional calm. Finally, her gaze settled on me. "I'm pregnant," she said, as if that explained everything. "We need security. We need to know our child will be provided for." "Your child will be provided for," I said gently. "Better than you can imagine. The trust will pay for the finest education, the best medical care, every opportunity a grandparent could want to give. But David won't have access to a penny of it." "You can't do this," David said, his voice rising. "Sarah is your daughter. You can't cut her out of your will over a wedding." "I'm not cutting her out of anything," I replied. "I'm protecting her inheritance from you." Helen smiled, the kind of smile that had probably terrified opposing counsel for 3 decades. "Mr. Miller, perhaps you'd like to call your own attorney, because I think you might need some independent legal advice about the implications of what we've discovered about your premarital investigation of your fiancé's mother." The threat hung in the air like smoke. David looked to Richard Collins for support, but the older lawyer was already gathering his papers. "I think," Collins said carefully, "that we may have been operating under some misunderstandings about the nature of this situation. Perhaps it would be best if we postponed any document signing until everyone has had time to consult with their respective counsel." "Excellent idea," Helen agreed. "Mrs. Richardson, shall we go? I think you've accomplished what you came here to do." I stood slowly, taking my time, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over the table like dust after an explosion. Sarah was crying now, silent tears that might have been genuine grief or calculated manipulation. I found I no longer cared which. "Sarah," I said softly, and she looked up with something that might have been hope. "When you're ready to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, call me. But call me alone." I turned to David, who was staring at the trust documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. "As for you," I said, my voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 62 years learning how to recognize predators, "stay away from my family. Stay away from my house. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my competency or my finances, Helen and I will have a very different kind of conversation about harassment and elder abuse." Daniel stood as well, pulling money from his wallet to cover whatever drinks had been ordered. "Sarah," he said to his sister, "you're welcome at my place if you need somewhere to think, but you come alone and you leave the financial scheming at the door." As we walked toward the exit, I could hear David's voice rising behind us, arguing with the lawyers, with Sarah, with anyone who would listen about fairness and rights and the unfairness of it all. The sound followed us out into the cool evening air where it was absorbed by the vast indifference of the universe. "How do you feel?" Helen asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside Francesca's. I considered the question carefully. Inside the restaurant, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who had seen her primarily as a pathway to easy money. Inside, David was learning that there were still women in the world who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated into surrendering what they'd built. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in months, I feel free." Helen nodded approvingly. "Good. Now comes the hard part, which is deciding what you want to build with that freedom." 3 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee for two, watching the morning sun paint geometric patterns across the linoleum floor Robert and I had installed 23 years ago. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. There was a distinction I was only beginning to understand. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. I'd come to appreciate punctuality even more since Francesca's, since I'd learned the value of people who said what they meant and did what they promised. "Right on time," I said, opening the door to find Grace Walker holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she had news to share. "I brought my grandmother's cornbread," Grace said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers over the past weeks. "And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday." Grace had appeared in my life like a small miracle disguised as a coincidence. 2 days after the dinner at Francesca's, she'd knocked on my door, introducing herself as my new neighbor, a recent widow who'd downsized to the duplex next door after 45 years in the house where she'd raised 4 children. At 67, Grace was trim and energetic with silver hair she wore in a practical bob and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough of life to know what mattered and what didn't. More importantly, she had a gift for listening without judgment and a complete immunity to other people's drama. "What kind of interesting?" I asked, pouring coffee into the mugs we'd picked out together at the antique store downtown, part of what Grace called my reclaiming project. "David Miller was at the bank yesterday," she said, accepting her mug with the satisfied expression of someone who enjoyed a good story. "Apparently, he was quite upset about some accounts being frozen." I sat down across from her, noting how natural this felt, having someone to share coffee with, someone who understood that gossip could be a form of justice when it exposed the right truths to the right people. Frozen accounts. Seems his business partner discovered some irregularities in their escrow account. Something about client deposits being used for personal expenses. Grace's eyes sparkled with the particular pleasure that came from watching Karma work with efficient precision. Word is he might be facing some professional difficulties. I absorbed this information with the careful neutrality I'd perfected over the past month. Since Francesca's, I'd learned that revenge was most satisfying when it was served by someone other than yourself, when the universe simply adjusted itself to reflect the natural consequences of poor choices. And Sarah? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Shopping for wedding dresses at the outlets in Greenville. Apparently, the Italian marble bathroom renovation has been postponed indefinitely. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking our coffee and listening to the sounds of our neighborhood coming alive. Children walking to school, cars starting, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life continuing despite the small dramas that occasionally disrupted it. Have you heard from Daniel? Grace asked. Yesterday. He said Sarah called him asking if he thought she was making a mistake. I set down my mug carefully. He told her that was a question only she could answer. Smart boy. Smart man, I corrected. He gets that from his father. The phone rang, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had become my body's automatic response to unexpected calls. But when I checked the display, it showed a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but not one in my contacts. Mrs. Richardson, the voice was young, female, nervous. This is Jennifer Hayes from the Meridian Community Center. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all. How can I help you? Well, this might sound strange, but we heard about your situation from Helen Williams. She mentioned that you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities. I looked at Grace, who was listening with the polite attention of someone who'd learned that other people's phone calls often contained interesting information. What kind of opportunities? We have a program for seniors who are dealing with financial exploitation. People whose families or caregivers are trying to take advantage of them. Helen thought you might be uniquely qualified to help. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family crisis might become the foundation for helping others navigate similar treacheries. But there was something appealing about the idea, something that felt like turning poison into medicine. Tell me more, I said. Part 4. For the next 20 minutes, Jennifer explained the program. Seniors helping seniors, sharing strategies for recognizing manipulation, resources for legal protection, emotional support for those who'd been betrayed by the people they trusted most. It was part support group, part advocacy organization, part early warning system for a community that was increasingly targeted by sophisticated scammers, both professional and familial. We meet Tuesday evenings at 7, Jennifer concluded. Very informal. Coffee and conversation mostly, but we've helped quite a few people avoid situations like what Helen described. I'll think about it, I said, though I was already thinking about it, already imagining myself in a room full of people who understood the particular pain of being seen as a resource rather than a person. After I hung up, Grace was looking at me with the expression of someone who'd recognized something significant. You're going to do it, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably. Good. You need something that's yours, something that has nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother or potential victim. It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had made Grace such an unexpected gift in my life. She understood transformation not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a gradual reclaiming of space that had always belonged to you. The afternoon brought another call, this one from Daniel. Mom, I wanted to give you a heads up. Sarah's been asking questions about the trust, specifically about whether there are any ways to modify it. And I told her that irrevocable means irrevocable, but she seems to think there might be loopholes. She mentioned something about undue influence, about Helen pressuring you into decisions you might not have made otherwise. I felt a familiar stirring of anger, but it was different now, cleaner, more focused. Not the fiery indignation of betrayal, but the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what had happened and why it had to be done. Tell her, I said calmly, that if she truly believes I was manipulated, she's welcome to pursue legal action. I'll be ready. So will Helen. There was a pause on the line, then a soft chuckle. I already did. And I think the conversation might have done more to open her eyes than anything else. I looked out the kitchen window at the small garden I'd planted. The tomatoes were ripening, the basil flourishing. Life went on, one seed at a time. Thank you for having my back, Daniel. Always, Mom. And for what it's worth, I think Sarah is scared, not just about losing money, but about becoming a parent and not knowing how to do it without control. Without expectations. I know, I said, sadness and love woven tightly together. And I hope, someday, she finds her way back. And if she does, I'll be here. But she'll come alone. Not with lawyers, not with conditions. We said goodbye, and as I hung up, I felt the weight of the past few months finally settle into something that resembled peace. That night, I stood at the back of the community center as Jennifer introduced me to the Tuesday evening group. The room was filled with people, some stooped with age, others still sharp-eyed and strong, all of them carrying stories of betrayal and resilience. I'm Margaret, I said when it was my turn to speak. And I guess I'm here because I finally remembered that boundaries aren't betrayals. Sometimes, love means saying no, and meaning it. There were nods. A few smiles. One woman reached out and took my hand. And in that simple gesture, I found the beginning of something new. Not just freedom. Not just recovery. But purpose. A second act. One I would write entirely on my own terms.